This week on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Commander Sisko and his crew investigate a case of murder. 30 years ago, on a planet you've never heard of. Also, sex. There's a small amount of sex involved. Got you back with that one, I bet. The sex is off screen. Lost you again, didn't I? This is a review of the Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode Dax. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know the identity of the turncoat who betrayed the Klystron army to the rebels, because I know, now that I've said it, you'd all hate to have the solution to that scintillating mystery spoiled for you, be warned, spoilers beyond this point. Is Jadzia Dax a killer? Can a joined Trill be held responsible for the crimes of a past host? Can the old lady judge from this episode be the judge for everything from now on? Let's get some answers. Dax and Bashir are hanging out at the Replimat. Bashir is trying desperately to get in her pants, as is typical for him in Season 1 of the show, while Dax is either distracted by the technobabble on her pad, or pretending to be distracted by the technobabble on her pad to discourage Bashir. Either way, it doesn't work, and after Dax says goodnight and excuses herself, Bashir decides that he should follow her to her quarters anyway. Yeah, there you go, Julian. Persistence. Persistence in the face of unambiguous rejection, that's what women like. In this case, Bashir's problematic romantic perseverance is a good thing, however, because on her way back to her room, Jadzia is stopped in the corridor by this guy, Tandro, and a couple of goons. He says, "Dax?" And Dax says, "Yeah." And he says, "Dax?" And Dax says, "Yeah." And Tandro says, "Get her, goons!" And the goons grab her. Bashir comes walking up and sees Jadzia struggling with the goons, and he's like, "Now's my chance! Bashir to the rescue!" And he charges in and wallops Tandro with a double axe handle so mighty that he not only knocks Tandro down, he knocks himself out as well. Tandro recovers, and the goons overpower Jadzia and drag her off. Bashir comes to and calls in Jadzia's abduction. Sisko, Kira, and Odo try to trace the movements of the gang who grabbed her, but they seem pretty good at evading security. Also, they've somehow disabled the station's tractor beam. While Sisko scrambles to fix that, Kira locks down all the docking ports and throws up some force fields, and Odo goes to try and intercept them before they can get to their ship. The sealed docking ports and force fields are no problem because Tandro has a thing that he slaps over the thing. Whenever you want to move unencumbered through a starship or a space station, you've got to remember to take along your thing to slap over the thing. You just slap your thing over the thing, push a few buttons, and you're good to go. Tandro and his goons make it onto their ship with Dax and leave the station, but Sisko fixes the tractor beam just in time, and the tractor beam reaches out and grabs Tandro's ship before it can get away. Sisko and Odo meet them at the airlock, and Sisko's like, "So, what was all that about?" And Tandro says, "We're from Klystron 4, and we have a treaty with the Federation that says we're allowed to just come in and take fugitives from our justice system without even asking. And Dax is a fugitive charged with treason and murder, the murder of my father." Seems like a conflict of interest to have a child pursuing the accused murderer of his parent, but I guess the Klystronians do things differently. It turns out the crimes Dax is accused of took place 30 years ago, long before Jadzia was the host of the Dax symbiont, before Jadzia was even born, in fact. This was during the time when the Dax slug lived in the belly of Curzon, Sisko's longtime friend and mentor. He's the reason Sisko calls Jadzia old man. Sisko doesn't think it's fair to try Jadzia for crimes Curzon may or may not have done, and he resolves to fight her extradition to Klystron. But Jadzia herself is oddly resigned about this whole thing. Sisko asks her to tell him what she knows about these charges, but she doesn't want to talk about it. Tandro won't be able to just take Jadzia back to Klystron, however, because even though the Klystronidians have a treaty with the Federation, They don't have one with the Bajorans, and Deep Space Nine is technically a Bajoran outpost. And since Tandro's ease at sabotaging the tractor beam and staying one step ahead of security while trying to abduct Dax suggests that he received assistance for his little raid from the Cardassians, who designed and built the station, remember, the Bajorans have decided to take a, hey, you know what, fuck you position on this matter and require that a formal hearing take place before Dax can be turned over to Tandro's custody. A formal hearing, the most stirring phrase in all of science fiction. Odo uses the threat of building code enforcement to force Quark into letting them use his bar for the hearing, since there is no dedicated hearing room, this being a shitty, refurbished space garage and all. Then Odo heads off to Klystron 4 to do some investigating into the charges against Dax. The hearing begins with the most awesome old lady judge ever presiding. She's 100 years old, and she wants this over with before she dies, so she has no time for any bullshit. She demands that both Tandro and Sisko get right to the point. Tandro says Dax is accused of committing treason and murder on Klystron 4 30 years ago. She should be forced to stand trial for those charges, because it doesn't matter what she looks like now, Jadzia Dax is still Dax. She's the same person. Sisko counters with, nuh-uh. And there we have the point of contention for the hearing. Odo is on Klystron 4 talking with Enina, Tandro's mother and the widow of General Tandro, the man Dax is accused of betraying and killing. Enina tells Odo that Dax, Curzon Dax, was a good friend of General Tandro, and he never would have betrayed him to the enemy. But someone revealed General Tandro's exact position to the rebel army right before he was taken and killed, and there were only 5 people who had that information, and the only one of them without a solid alibi was Curzon Dax. So, you know, it ain't looking too good. And Enina says, how is Curzon these days anyway? And Odo says, try to keep up, sister. You're still a Dax behind. We're on to Jadzia Dax now. Curzon's dead. He's dead. He's fucking dead. And Nina's like, good to know. Back at the hearing, Tandro calls a Trill expert, just some random Trill guy he grabbed in the hallway, I guess. Actually, this Trill guy was sent by the Trill government when they heard about Dax possibly being extradited. He's just there to observe, and then when it's over, he's supposed to go home and say, yep, there was a Trill there all right. Sounds like good work if you can get it. Tandro asks him if a Trill host still remembers the experiences the symbiont had with previous hosts. The Trill guy is like, yep. Tandro says, and if the symbiont did a bad thing in a previous host, the current host would still feel the guilt of the act? Trill guy is like, oh, yeah, I still feel guilty for all the fucked up shit my belly slug did back in the day. This one time, a guy asked him for a Sprite, and he brought him a Starry instead. Can you imagine? Sisko questions the Trill guy and establishes that even though each host gains the accumulated memories of the symbiont's experiences with past hosts, every time the symbiont joins with a new host, the personality of the host and that of the symbiont merge to form a new, unique person, a combination of host and symbiont. Sisko's like, aha, see? Jadzia's a new person. She's not the same as Curzon. Therefore, she can't be held responsible for any crimes Curzon may have committed. Case closed, I win. Tandro gets in Sisko's face, like, by your logic, all a Trill would have to do to get away with murder is avoid arrest long enough to change hosts. Her belly slug killed my father. My father's blood cries out from the ground for revenge! Revenge! The old lady judge slams down her, whatever that is, her judicial sphere, her orb of justice. She slams down her orb of justice and says, shut up and sit down. We're taking a 2-hour recess because it's time for my stories. I already missed the Price is Right for this shit, and I am watching The Young and the Restless. Today is Eric Braden's last episode. After the recess, Dr. Bashir takes the stand and explains, during questioning from Sisko, that Curzon Dax and Jadzia Dax are distinct people. Different genders, different blood types, and Jadzia's bod is way more slammin'. Plus, they have distinct brainwave patterns, proving that Jadzia is definitely not the same person as Curzon was. Tandro steps up and says, what about just the brainwave patterns of the Dax symbiont? If you analyzed those, would they be the same now as they were when it was hosted by Curzon? Bashir's like, it makes no sense to analyze the symbionts separate from the host, since their brains always function together as a unit. Tandro's like, right, but what if you did analyze the symbionts separately? Why would you do that? That's dumb. You're dumb. You're just a dumb asshole. After some more tenacious questioning from Tandro, Bashir is forced to admit that there's no reason to believe the Dax symbiont itself has changed since Jadzia became its host. Sisko takes the stand himself to talk about how Curzon was very different from Jadzia. Tandro tries to get Sisko to admit that the Dax symbiont deserves to be punished for its crimes, even if it currently lives in a different host, but Judge Old Lady gets impatient, calls another recess so she can catch up on the episode of The Bold and the Beautiful she DVR'd, and declares that Dax herself will testify when they reconvene. Odo is still digging around on Klystron 4, and he's found evidence that Curzon Dax and Inina, the widow of the murdered General Tandro, were having an affair. That looks bad for Dax's case, since an affair with General Tandro's wife might have provided Curzon with a motive for murder. Odo confronts Inina with this evidence, and she tells him that while General Tandro is remembered as a great hero today, personally, he was a bit of a bastard. She doesn't admit to an affair with Curzon, but she doesn't deny it either. So that's why Jadzia has been so reluctant to speak up in her own defense. She's trying to protect the reputation of Inina, not only for the sake of the people of Klystron, who revere General Tandro and admire Inina as his noble and faithful wife and keeper of his legacy, but also because Curzon truly loved Inina. Jadzia takes the stand at the hearing. Sisko prompts her to talk about how awesome she was on her own before she was joined with the Dax symbiont, and argues that it's ridiculous to suggest that she should be tried for crimes that were committed before she was even born. Tandro takes his turn and says, before they stuck that slug in your belly, you accepted all the responsibilities and consequences of hosting that slug, didn't you? Jadzia's like, sure did. Tandro says, and does that include being punished for murdering my daddy? Before Jadzia can answer, the hearing is interrupted by the arrival of Odo and Inina. Announcing herself as the widow of General Tandro, Inina declares that this hearing is unnecessary because the charges against Curzon Dax are false. Tandro starts to protest, but Inina's like, silence, my disappointing son. Judge Old Lady, I know for a fact that Curzon Dax did not send the message that betrayed my husband to the rebels, because when the message was sent, Curzon Dax was in my bed. And he was sending a message all right, but it wasn't to the rebels. He tapped that shit out in Morse code straight onto my devil's doorbell like ... Jesus, Mom! Oh, grow up. I'm allowed to have a life too. Judge Old Lady is like, case dismissed. If I hurry, I can still catch the early bird at the Replimat. Later, Jadzia and Inina are taking a stroll on the upper level of the promenade and resolving a few loose ends from the case. It turns out the person who sent that secret message and betrayed General Tandro's position to the rebels 30 years ago was General Tandro himself, who turned on his own people and was subsequently murdered by the rebels because you reap what you sow, I guess. Inina thanks Jadzia for protecting the secret of her affair with Curzon, and for preserving the memory of General Tandro as a hero to his people, even though he was actually a massive piece of shit. Before they part, Inina says to Jadzia, do me one last favor. Live. Live a good, long life. Jadzia's like, you got it, hot stuff. And she did. The end. If you watch enough of these retro Star Trek reviews, you'll hear me repeat this sentiment at least a few times, but I really like the first season of Deep Space Nine. It's not a perfect show. It's a little wobbly out of the gate. There are definitely some crummy episodes in there, but there are also some genuinely great ones and some nice, solid good ones. Dax is one of the good ones. Not a classic, but a well-made serving of meat and potatoes, an example of the kind of show Deep Space Nine is in its early years. It's pre-Worf years. It's pre-Defiant years. It's pre-Dominion years, when the scope of the series was more tightly centered on Bajor and the station itself, and the stakes were more personal and less galactic. I'm not saying I don't like the show it became. I love that show. I'm just saying I like the show it started out as, too. And it's all the same show. Just like Dax is simultaneously different people and the same person. Did I plan that? Let's say I did. With this episode, as they would do repeatedly throughout their show's run, the creators of Deep Space Nine found a way to put a fresh spin on a familiar premise. We'd seen Courtroom episodes before in Star Trek. Obviously, if you've been watching this series of reviews, we're 4 videos deep in the Courtroom episodes batch. But Dax, the episode, uses the extradition hearing that becomes the centerpiece of the story as a vehicle to explore complex questions of identity and to present a whodunit that is ultimately pretty basic and predictable, but still entertaining in a lurid, soapy sort of way. The issues of identity the episode wrestles with are right in the wheelhouse of D.C. Fontana, who co-wrote the teleplay with Peter Allen Fields from an original story by Fields. Fontana, arguably the most important writer on Star Trek the original series, returned to Star Trek for the final time as a credited writer with this episode, and she made it count. Fontana's work often explores identity, who the characters are, what makes them who they are. In this case, Dax, the character, is made the center of a conflict over who she is and how she should be treated. A conflict she didn't seek, doesn't want, and tries very hard to not participate in, even though the potential consequences to her are extremely serious. That situation, having your identity become the focus of a conflict you didn't ask for and don't want, and having that conflict consist of people arguing about you while you yourself aren't really included in the arguing, might sound familiar to some of you. It might sound like experiences you've had in your own lives. Jadzia Dax is often cited as a queer-coded character and has proven especially compelling to trans people who view Jadzia's experiences as a joined trill as metaphorically reflecting their own experiences. Though I don't think the episode was written with the trans experience in mind. The episode was produced at a time when, unfortunately, trans issues were rarely considered in popular fiction and were almost never considered in a way that was thoughtful or sympathetic. I do see how Jadzia, and particularly this episode, could resonate with trans folks in the audience. The Dax symbiont, as it moves from host to host, has experienced life as different people, but has also remained itself the entire time. Jadzia had a life before being joined, and now post-joining is simultaneously the same person she always was, and a new person who came into being as a result of the joining. Seen from both of these perspectives, Dax and Trill joining can be read as a metaphor for transition. You're a different person in a sense, pre- and post-transition, but you're also always the same person. And in this way, Dax's story is relatable to all of us, whether we're trans or cis, because we can all have that experience of feeling alienated from our own lives, of looking back on something we did when we were young and thinking, I can't believe I did that. It's like I was a completely different person, but knowing that we weren't, that while we may have changed, we have always remained ourselves. Discussions of identity are always complex because identity itself is a complex concept. The whodunit aspect of the episode, on the other hand, isn't all that complex. Like I said, it's fun in its way, but it's also the weakest part of the episode. The resolution with Inina stepping up to save the day by confirming that Curzon couldn't have done the crime because he was giving her the time is predictable, and the last-second expository dialogue between Inina and Dax to resolve the who betrayed General Tandro mystery, he betrayed himself, what a twist, feels like an afterthought. The actual hearing is great, though. Probably not all that realistic, but who cares? Courtroom scenes in movies and TV shows are almost never realistic. Plus, this is Star Trek. Plus, Judge Old Lady makes it clear at the beginning that it will be an informal hearing. So if things get a little theatrical, I think we can cut it some slack. Judge Old Lady, played by Anne Haney, is one of the highlights of the episode, an absolute delight, impatient and perpetually annoyed, wanting to resolve this dispute fairly, but also wanting to get this the hell over with. Despite the informality and occasional theatricality, certain moments of the hearing stand out as authentic, or authentic relative to the rest of it, anyway. For example, the exchange between Bashir and Tandro, who is played by the always excellent Gregory Itzin, where Tandro is trying to get Bashir to admit that the Dax symbiont's brainwaves are the same now with Jadzia as they were then with Curzon. Bashir, who is on Dax's side obviously, keeps trying to evade the point Tandro is making, but Tandro comes back to it again and again, backing Bashir into a corner until he has no choice but to acknowledge that what Tandro is saying is true. I feel like I've seen exchanges very much like that in footage from actual trials. Beyond the hearing and the central dilemma, I also like the opening scenes of Dax's attempted abduction. The episode does a fair job of building up suspense as Tandro and his team attempt to escape with Dax. Obviously, you assume that by the end of the episode, Dax is going to be okay, but in the moment, you don't know what's going to happen next, or where the episode is going to go. Will these people take Dax away, requiring Sisko to embark on a search to bring her back? Will they be stopped before they leave the station? Is this gonna turn into a hostage situation? Will Bashir work on his balance so that next time he throws a punch, he doesn't knock himself out as well? There are genuinely compelling questions raised in those opening minutes. I think there's too much technobabble about fixing the tractor beam leading up to it, but that grabbing the ship with the tractor beam right before it can get away bit is nicely done and kind of exciting. This is an early episode of Deep Space Nine, originally airing a mere 5 weeks after the series premiere, and it's a really important show for setting the tone. We learn more about Dax, sure, that's important, and her friendship with Sisko, also important, but more fundamentally, the kind of series Deep Space Nine is and will be starts to come into sharp focus here. Dax is accused of treason and murder, acts which it turns out she, as Curzon, was innocent of, but which Curzon could plausibly have committed nonetheless. And Curzon did have an affair with the wife of one of his close friends, something Jadzia still feels guilty over. Sisko is determined to win the hearing and save Dax from extradition, whether Curzon was guilty of those crimes or not. He meets with Kira and Bashir and basically tells them, find evidence that supports our case, even if you have to ignore all the evidence you find against it. His loyalty isn't to the truth or to justice. It's to his people and his friend. Even the detail of Odo commandeering Quark's bar to use as the space for the hearing is meaningful and tells us something about the show and its primary setting. Deep Space Nine is a mess. It's a junkyard. It's not the pristine, state-of-the-art pride of the fleet like the Enterprise. Just as Curzon and Jadzia are both themselves and also both Dax, this show is Star Trek, but it's also Deep Space Nine. Dax, the episode, gives us an early, illustrative example of what that means. Those are my thoughts on Dax. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Please join me next time as this batch of reviews of Courtroom episodes continues. Next up is another one from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, this one from Season 4. It's an episode titled Rules of Engagement. That's next time. See you then. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.